Do you realize that the Jewish gangsters went after the Nazis in the lead up to World War II? This is Robert Manni, host of Guys TV, and this week my special guest is Michael Benson. He's written a book about that. It all starts right here, right now on Guys TV. You can also catch me on KCAA Radio here in Southern California and Guys Radio, my worldwide podcast. Guys TV, Guys Radio, thanks for your support. Okay, Guys Radio, we've got a wonderful guest today. His name is Michael Benson. He's one of the world's most popular true crime writers. His books including Nightmare in Rochester, Betrayal in Blood, Killer Twins, The Devil at Genesee Junction tell of heinous criminals, their victims, and the lawmen who bring them to justice. He's recently been seen on ABC's 2020. He's a regular commentator on the Investigation Discovery, ID, Oxygen, HLN channels. He's appeared on Murder in the Family with Geraldo, Inside Evil with Chris Cuomo, People Magazine investigates evil twins, etc. During his decades as a professional writer, Michael has worked with former gangsters for biographies on Mafia Dons Carmine Persico and Albert Anastasia. He's worked with a retired Army intelligence agent doing the tense days after 9/11 for a book about the CIA. He's also worked with a retired FBI agent for a book about national security. So he really digs in and gets the real info that we want to share with you. He's co-written 2 books with former NYPD Department Cop of the Year, explored the grassy knoll in Dallas with a former KGB agent while researching his highly acclaimed Who's Who in the JFK assassination. He's collaborated with an astronaut and covered the Stephen Haynes triple murder in New Haven, Connecticut for the New York Post. His latest book that we're going to focus on today is called Gangsters versus Nazis: How Jewish Mobsters Battled Nazis in Wartime America. It's a story that needs to be brought to film, and I'm surprised it hasn't, but it's something that nobody ever talks about, but it's a really fascinating story about how the gangsters, the Jewish gangsters, and also some of the traditional mafia went after some of the kind of Nazi groups springing up prior to World War II in America. So long story short, welcome to Guys Radio, Michael Benson.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks for having me.
So let's start at the beginning. I mean, you have a very varied background as a writer, and you dig a lot into the true crime area. How did you get started as a writer? Is this what you wanted to do? And how did you kind of hone in on this genre?
Well, when I was volunteered, when I was 9 years old, my babysitter and her friend were brutally murdered by a psycho killer. I lived out in the country. They were killed in my back field. Then they weren't found for a month. They'd been horribly butchered. Jack the Ripper type crime, never solved. Kind of messed up my childhood. I started writing about it when I was 11, 2 years later, and 43 years later, it became The Devil at Genesee Junction. I went back in 2011 to my hometown, teamed up with a private investigator and the mom of one of the victims, and we solved the crime.
Wow, that is amazing. How did you solve the crime?
Well, what happened was the sheriff's department only talked to the adults in the neighborhood. They didn't talk to the kids. And I went on the air in Rochester in 2011. Pardon me, that's my phone. And said, if anybody knows anything, please get in touch. And what happened was we got a series of women in their 50s who said, when I was 9, these brothers dragged me back in the woods, had their way with me, and told me I was dead meat if I told anybody. And this resembles the crime that happened, with the exception of the murders themselves. And we honed in on those brothers and found out, one of them was married to a victim's cousin and lived 2 doors away from the other victim, and they were in and out of these girls' houses, and they were creeps. So, but for some reason, that escaped the law enforcement in 1966 because they didn't think the kids knew anything.
Wow! And then were these criminals, were they put away then?
Oh yeah, they were dead by the time my investigation started.
Okay.
The guy who I believe committed the murders was killed in prison in Texas about 2 weeks after going in for 70 years for incest.
Wow. Well, good job.
Yeah, thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you for your service. I mean, that's a really big deal. So what's the name of the book that focuses on that?
That's The Devil at Genesee Junction.
Okay.
That's the area where I grew up.
All right. Was that your first book?
It was not. I knew, I was smart enough to know that I didn't know how to do an investigation. So I wrote a couple of true crime books first before I went after the big one. I did the BTK case as a ghostwriter, and then I did a series of mass market paperbacks for Kensington on various crimes, including one up in the Rochester area where I grew up. And by that time, I knew that I was ready, and I put my ducks in a row and started investigating Georgiana and Kathy's murders when I was 9.
Wow. Well, let's talk about this new book here, Gangsters versus
Yes.
Nazis. This is how Jewish mobsters battled Nazis in wartime in America. And it's an amazing story because it's something that happened that you would think people would be talking about or have talked about, but I've never heard about this. And it's very interesting and it makes perfect sense. So how did the idea, the concept come to you, Michael?
Well, parts of the story I knew already. I knew about Jack Ruby's involvement because of my work with the Kennedy assassination. And I had written a couple of mob books. So I knew the cast of characters involved. My agent, Doug Grad of Doug Grad Literary Agency, he told me on the third fairway of a golf course while we were having a meeting that he'd read an article about this, that Judge Nathan Perlman, a New York City judge, had gone to Meyer Lansky, the all-time greatest Jewish gangster, and had asked for help getting the German-American Bund and the Silver Lodge, the two predominant Nazi groups in America in 1938, to shut up. I mean, it wasn't the war hadn't happened yet, but these guys were going around. They were brazen in their behavior. There was, Jews are a cancer. They need to be cut out of society, saying all this horrible stuff. And because there were no hate laws at the time, there was no way to stop them. As long as they didn't say anything obscene or shout fire in a crowded room, they could talk about hating Jews and how Jews should be eliminated as much as they wanted. Nobody could do anything about it. So Judge Perlman was particularly offended by this one day when he was at a patriotic ceremony in the Bowling Green section of Manhattan, and it was interrupted by the German-American Bund creeps marching and carrying signs and chanting about hating Jews and loving Hitler, Sieg Heiling and goose stepping. And Judge Perlman had a couple of cocktails and thought outside the box. And he gave a call to Meyer Lansky and said, can you teach these guys a lesson and let them know that if they're going to go on saying these things, they're going to have problems? And Lansky said, sure. But Judge, I'll tell you the truth, we can do better than just slap them around. We could take care of them if you want. And the judge said, no. If you start killing these guys, we're going to lose the moral high ground and it's all going to end right away. You just have to beat them up. You got to mess them up. So Lansky put together a team of fighters made up of Murder Inc., the Jewish members of Murder Inc., whose only job was to kill people that were on the hit list of the commissioners of the 5 families. Gave them a couple of boxing lessons, gave them some brass knuckles and sawed off pool cues. And the next time the German-American Bund had a big rally in Manhattan at the Yorkville Casino on East 86th Street in Manhattan, gangsters went in there and started punching them in the nose. And I think the closest they came to killing somebody was when Lansky and another fellow dropped one of the Nazis out of a 2nd-story window. If he'd landed on his head, that would have been it for no killing. But he landed on his legs, accordioned one leg, and that was the worst injury they had. But it got Mayor LaGuardia's attention, and LaGuardia kicked the Nazis out of Manhattan, at which point the battle against them moved to Newark and then to Chicago and to Minneapolis and Los Angeles, other major cities where Judge Perlman knew top gangsters, probably because of relationships during Prohibition, not necessarily through the justice system. So what you have is a story where the good guys are breaking all of the laws and the bad guys, the villains, are breaking no laws. It's the twilight zone between what is legal and what is just.
How did the police get their instructions to kind of allow this to happen? Because I'm sure they must have been in on this. Was this through the judge, through the police commissioner, or how did they do that?
The judge made some phone calls, and the police usually showed up just in time to do no good whatsoever, kind of pick up the pieces. And one of the smart things that Lansky did was he brought with him to the first riot in Yorkville a box of American Legion hats, brand new crisp American Legion hats. And he told his boys to put them on, and then on their way out after the fight, lose the hats. And sure enough, 48 hours later, the New York Times is saying, well, the NYPD believes that it was American Legion guys who had fought the Germans during World War I and didn't like the idea that they're becoming aggressive again, when in reality it was gangsters. And Lansky got that idea from Albert Anastasia, who used to put Chicago-made hats on his hit teams, and then they'd lose the hats on the way out. And the NYPD, instead of looking in Brooklyn where the killers were, would say to the press, well, we think that they brought them in from Chicago.
What were what's the genesis of the fascism that had been growing so much coming out of, I guess, World War I and then the Depression, and the need to point a finger at somebody to make to demonize a group, and it turned out to be the Jews here. And at the same time, the U.S. had stayed out of World War II, and Hitler was really stomping on all over Europe. And Japan was in the act, as was Italy and Northern Africa, and Japan, I guess, in Asia. What was going on there? Why was the rise of fascism so prominent here in the States, and the U.S. kind of staying out of things, in your opinion, from doing your research?
Well, I think those are two separate questions. I think that anti-Semitism was a direct reaction to 9 years of depression. Scapegoating a group was really easy under those circumstances because people felt like they didn't have any money. They hadn't had any money in a long time. Nobody had any money. So it was very easy for these guys to say, the Jews have all the money. That's why you don't have any. And they have all the money because they're communists, which makes no sense whatsoever if you think about it intellectually. But these people didn't. They just, Jews are bad. The question about why we hadn't gotten involved in the war is basically because Gentiles didn't think we had a dog in the fight yet. It's hard to fathom now, but until the mass exposure of the Holocaust, the whole notion that there was genocide going on in Europe was something that Jewish people knew because they were getting letters from their relatives in Europe, but Gentiles never really latched onto until the proof was in their face. And even then, Life magazine published the first photos of the release of the concentration camps with those horrible pictures of the skeleton people, without mentioning that all of the victims were Jewish. They just said these are, the horrible German camps, and they made it seem like an act of patriotism to release them, rather than emphasizing the fact that these were all Jewish people, and Hitler's goal was to wipe Jewish people off the face of the earth.
Okay, so the U.S. stayed out of the war, and then Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. And from my reading your book, it seemed like the last thing that Hitler wanted was the U.S. to get involved, because he was doing pretty good without us getting in there, and knew that we would turn the tide. So what do you think precipitated the bombing of Pearl Harbor by Japan? Was that something they did on their own?
Oh, I think so. I think Japan's own notion of world conquest was largely separate. We think of them as the Axis powers, but Japan and Germany weren't in cahoots in a lot of different ways. We had the Atlantic and we had the Pacific, and they were separate wars. Happened at the same time, and I'm sure that Hitler was ticked off at the bombing of Pearl Harbor, because the last thing he wanted was to go to war with America, because we were a sleeping giant. He wanted nothing more than to take over Hollywood, so that instead of making pro-democracy movies, Hollywood would make pro-fascist movies, win the hearts and minds of America, and he'd be able to take care of that hemisphere without firing a shot. Didn't work because his plans were, they weren't well made.
Mm-hmm.
He put in a force in California without making one strong leader. And a Jewish group infiltrated them, got them all backstabbing each other figuratively, and it fell apart. But their plans were to kidnap the Jewish moguls of the studios, to kidnap the top Jewish stars, and to publicly execute them, which again shows that Hitler doesn't understand the hearts and minds of America,
Right.
because that would not have won over our hearts to have Charlie Chaplin hung in on Sunset Boulevard would not have helped anything.
Okay. Guys Radio, my special guest is Michael Benson. We're talking about his new book, Gangsters versus Nazis, How Jewish Mobsters Battled Nazis in Wartime America. So we had a stronghold of Germans and Jews in New York, but in other areas of the country, we had similar factions, dual factions going on in the Midwest. Minnesota had a lot of Jewish people. I didn't realize that. And I know Chicago and a lot of the Great Lakes cities have a lot of Germans. So how did that all come together? Were the movements spreading together, or were these things cropping up on their own separately in terms of what was happening in New York versus what was happening in other areas? You mentioned Hollywood, but the Midwest is a German stronghold, and there was a huge Jewish influx in Minnesota.
Well, Fritz Kuhn, who was the leader of the German American Bund, he had outposts in all of the major cities where there were large German communities. And in those in which there were also large Jewish communities, that's where the fights took place. So I mean, there were also a lot of German American Nazis in Texas, but gangsters didn't punch anybody in the nose down there because they would have all been shot. So but in Minnesota, you could get away with it. And because it was a war over speech and not a war over killing, it wasn't like World War II. It played by playground rules almost. I mean, nobody even pulled a knife. You know, they were fist fights, and the Jewish men won every single time. I think that the one that shocked me the most was Minneapolis, St. Paul, where there was a list of Nazi sympathizers that was just really long. And there, the number one guy, the number one group was the Silver Lodge, different from the German American Bund, just as fascist, not quite as German. And there's some Scandinavian too.
Okay.
And these guys were really, really anti-Semitic. And Davy Berman in Minneapolis, he led the fight against them, and it wasn't as violent. There were not heads getting busted as much. A lot of the meetings there were in private houses, and what the gangsters would do is they'd pelt the house with rotten vegetables. At one time, the host of the meeting came out in his tuxedo, and they grabbed him and they threw him in a pond. So when he went back to the meeting, he was soaking wet. So it was that kind of somewhat harmless humiliations going on, rather than in New York and LA where skulls were getting cracked.
Right. It sounds like also the traditional mob was involved, because there was a relationship between Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano. So was there some type of handshake agreement on how to handle this, even though the Italians in Italy were invading North Africa and were considered an Axis power? How did that dynamic work out?
Well, first of all, yeah, the fascists in Italy and the mafia, the actual Mafia, they were enemies. They were competing governments, and Luciano couldn't be more mafia, and he grew up on the same block with Lansky. And when Lansky told him about Judge Perlman's request, Luciano says, "You want the Italian guys too? Well, we can bust some Nazi heads. What the heck?" And Lansky said, "No, we're doing this for our Jewish brothers in Europe who are suffering now." Perlman offered to pay them. They said, "No, we will take no money. It's our patriotic duty to do this." In fact, across the country, Mickey Cohen, Bugsy Siegel in LA refused to take money. No, just because we're hoods don't mean we ain't no patriots.
Got it. Okay.
And,
The war. So what happened when the war started then, Michael, with all these groups? There was a lot of, again, in New York and some of the major cities, a lot of beatdowns of the trying to keep the Bund groups down. So the war starts. What happens now? Do those groups go underground? And what happened after the war also?
Well, the war pretty much resets, like at the end of a sitcom. The Pearl Harbor changes everything. The leaders of the German groups who were hiding behind the First Amendment are now committing sedition. So they're breaking the law. Their followers are being drafted and being sent to the Pacific where their allegiances won't be questioned. The Jewish fighters are also being drafted. They're being sent to Europe. In fact, Nat Arno, who fought against Nazis in the streets of Newark, New Jersey, says that twice, while between Normandy and Berlin, which he walked on foot, touring Europe the hard way, he says twice he ran into POWs being marched in the other direction that he recognized from street fights in Newark. So yeah, everybody's role changes, and the fights of 1938 and 39 are forgotten. But I think the one that sticks in our history the most is the big garden party where the Nazis, the German American Bund, had its last ditch attempt, and they filled Madison Square Garden in New York with a pro-America event, which was actually a pro-German event. And they had security, New York cops guarding the doors to make sure that there wasn't a riot. And the entire garden at that time was up on 58th Street. It was surrounded by protesting groups. We don't even know if the gangsters were there. They were probably there, but they were lost in the crowd if they were. And one man, Izzy Greenbaum, an unemployed plumber, sneaks into Madison Square Garden, runs up on the stage during Fritz Kuhn's speech, pulls the plug on his microphone, shouts something into the crowd, which I can't repeat here, and is tackled by security. And they pull down his pants, which gets a big laugh from the Nazi crowd. And then he is rescued by New York police, spends the night in jail. And the next morning, he's in court, and the courtroom was filled with rich Jewish men saying, I want to pay his bail. I want to pay his bail. I want to pay his bail. Amazing. And this big German rally, which was supposed to get headlines all over the country, instead, Izzy stole the show.
Okay, my special guest on Guys Radio, Michael Benson, co-author of Mafia Hitman and Carmine the Snake, other books about gangsters, and this one's called Gangsters versus Nazis, How Jewish Mobsters Battled Nazis in Wartime America. Last question for you, Michael. Looking at today, do you see any similarities as to what's going on with some of these Aryan groups that are cropping up or coming out from under the rocks, if you will, and being brought more into the surface again, as they were back in the 30s and 40s?
Oh, I absolutely see a connection. There was a story on New York News this morning that somebody was passing leaflets in Rockville Center, Long Island, saying that the Jews are behind all of our problems. Oh, the Jews are behind COVID. That was it. The Jews are responsible for COVID. So they need to be wiped out from society. It was very familiar, very similar to what they were saying in 1938, just different problem. And of course, everybody's up in arms about it. I don't think you can get away with having fist fights anymore. I think there are too many guns. I think we resort to violence much quicker than we did in 1938 as a society. But I'm encouraged by one thing. There was I think it was called Reawaken America, was a group that was coming to Rochester, New York, again, where I grew up. And they were going to have an event in the Rochester Main Street Armory, big arena. And every other act that was booked to play there this summer says, we're not showing up if you have them.
Got it.
So Rochester's not going to be host to that event anymore. And maybe that's just as good as a punch in the nose.
Okay, Michael Benson, my special guest on Guys Radio. Nice job. Again, the book, Gangsters versus Nazis. Where can our listeners and viewers find out more about you, Michael? Real quick, what's your website?
Well, yeah, I have an Amazon page. I think if you go in your search engine and you put @author Michael Benson, all one word, it takes you to my Amazon.com page, which has every book I've ever written and a little biography and stuff. I think author Michael Benson gets you to me on where did I write that down?
Okay, just use your name. We'll find it.
I don't have my own website.
Okay,
but you can find me. I'm the one with the white beard.
Okay, all right. Thanks for being on our show, and best of luck for you. Keep writing.
Thank you, Robert.
If
Appreciate
you
it.
enjoy the guests and content I bring you each and every week on Guys Radio and TV, please help out by subscribing to my channels. Thanks for your support.